Welcome to another episode of Serial Killer Files by Skoob. I'm your host, Arthur Morgan, and today we're diving into one of the most chilling stories of religious extremism and family violence in American history. This is the story of Ervil LeBaron, a man who turned faith into a weapon, family into victims, and followers into killers. They called him the Mormon Manson, and by the time his reign of terror ended, dozens were dead, families were destroyed, and a legacy of violence would continue long after his death. Picture this: February 22, 1925, in a remote Mexican colony called Colonia LeBaron. A child is born who will grow up to become one of the most dangerous religious leaders America has ever seen. Ervil Morel LeBaron entered a world already steeped in religious extremism and polygamy. His father had moved the family to northern Mexico for one reason: to practice plural marriage after the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had banned it. This wasn't just a family relocating. This was a deliberate separation from mainstream society, creating the perfect breeding ground for the extremism that would later define Ervil's life. Growing up in this isolated community, Ervil was surrounded by strict religious teachings and the belief that they were living God's true law, while the rest of the world had fallen into apostasy. But even in this environment of religious fundamentalism, Ervil stood out. He was larger than life, literally, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing 240 pounds, with a presence that commanded attention and, according to many accounts, was irresistibly attractive to women. But it was his mind that truly set him apart. From an early age, Ervil displayed an insatiable hunger for power and recognition. His brother Alma later recalled that Ervil used to dream about having 25 or 30 wives so he could multiply and replenish the earth. He wanted to be like Brigham Young, a great man. Ervil fancied himself a brilliant writer and scriptorian. He would write obsessively in marathon sessions that could last for days. Rena Chenoweth, who would later become his 13th wife and a key player in his most notorious murder, described these writing binges. He would go for days without shaving or bathing, putting in 20 hours a day, sustaining himself on continuous cups of coffee. When he sweated, that was all you could smell coming out of his pores: coffee. This obsessive writing wasn't just hobby. It was the foundation of his future power. Through his writings, Ervil would later justify murder, create hit lists, and establish the doctrinal foundation for a campaign of terror that would span decades. For years, Ervil worked in the shadow of his older brother Joel in their fundamentalist Mormon group, the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. Joel was everything Ervil wasn't: peaceful, spiritual, focused on community rather than conquest. Followers described Joel as saint-like, a man genuinely interested in living according to his religious principles. But working under Joel's leadership was slowly eating away at Ervil. Where Joel preached peace, Ervil craved power. Where Joel was content with spiritual leadership, Ervil wanted absolute authority. The tension between the brothers was building like pressure in a volcano. The first major crack appeared in November 1969, when Joel, recognizing his brother's dangerous ambitions and insubordination, made a fateful decision. He kicked Ervil out of the church. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was the moment that would unleash one of the most violent religious campaigns in American history. Ervil's response was swift and terrifying. He claimed to receive a divine revelation. God had told him that Joel had become an obstacle to his work and needed to be removed. Not demoted, not corrected, removed, permanently. Ervil quickly founded his own group, the Church of the Lamb of God, declaring himself the true prophet, the one mighty and strong, destined to lead all of God's people. But declaring himself prophet wasn't enough. Joel's very existence was a challenge to Ervil's authority, and in Ervil's twisted theology, challenges to his authority were challenges to God himself. On August 20th, 1972, in the polygamous settlement of Los Molinos on Mexico's Baja Peninsula, Joel LeBaron was lured to what he thought was a peaceful meeting. Instead, he was brutally murdered, shot in the throat and head by one of Ervil's followers. The saint-like brother was dead, killed on the orders of his own flesh and blood. This wasn't just fratricide. This was the opening shot in what would become known as the Mormon Wars, a campaign of religiously motivated violence that would terrorize polygamous communities for decades. To understand how Ervil LeBaron convinced ordinary people to become killers, you have to understand the twisted theology he created. At the center of his belief system was an ancient Mormon concept called blood atonement, the idea that certain sins could only be forgiven if the sinner's blood was shed. Now, this wasn't some fringe idea that Ervil invented. Blood atonement has roots in early Mormon history, but by Ervil's time, it had been abandoned by the mainstream Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and rejected by most fundamentalist groups. For Ervil, however, it became the cornerstone of his faith and the justification for murder. But Ervil's interpretation went far beyond anything that had come before. In his twisted theology, anyone who opposed him, questioned his authority, or tried to leave his group was committing a sin that could only be cleansed through death. He wasn't just a religious leader. He was God's executioner on earth. Blood will run to solve our problems, Ervil once declared, and he meant every word. He created lists of people he called sons of perdition, individuals who were beyond redemption and marked for death. These weren't just theological concepts to Ervil. They were literal hit lists. His followers later described how he could make murder sound like mercy. He convinced them that killing the disobedient was actually saving their souls, that they were performing a sacred duty that would bring them closer to God. One former member recalled, "He made it sound like God himself was speaking through him, and if you didn't obey, you were risking your soul." While imprisoned, Ervil wrote a document called the Book of New Covenants, which included detailed lists of people marked for death. This wasn't just religious writing. It was a blueprint for murder that his followers would use for years after his death. What makes Ervil LeBaron's story particularly horrifying is his willingness to kill his own family members. This wasn't a man who simply eliminated enemies. He murdered his own blood without hesitation when they stood in his way. We've already heard about Joel's murder, but that was just the beginning. Ervil had multiple brothers, and he saw each one as either a potential follower or a necessary victim. Ervil LeBaron, another brother who had followers of his own, became a constant target. Throughout the mid-1970s, Ervil sent hit squads to find and kill Ervil. In December 1974, this hunt led to one of the most shocking acts of domestic terrorism in the Mormon fundamentalist communities. Ervil orchestrated a commando-style raid on the village of Los Molinos, the same settlement where Joel had been murdered. His followers threw Molotov cocktails into homes and sprayed the area with gunfire, looking for Ervil. They didn't find him, but they killed 2 innocent people and wounded 15 others. This wasn't targeted assassination anymore. This was terrorism designed to spread fear throughout the entire community. But perhaps the most chilling example of Ervil's willingness to kill family was the murder of his own daughter. Rebecca LeBaron was young and pregnant when she began to question her father's violent methods. In Ervil's world, questioning him was equivalent to questioning God, a capital offense even when it came from his own child. According to later testimonies from family members, Ervil ordered his followers to strangle Rebecca to death. She was buried in a hidden grave in the mountains. Ervil reportedly told his inner circle that it was better for her to die than to live as a daughter of perdition. Think about that for a moment. A father ordering the execution of his own pregnant daughter because she dared to question his methods. This wasn't religious extremism. This was pure evil, disguised as faith. Daniel Ben Jordan, the man who had carried out Joel's murder on Ervil's orders, eventually met the same fate. In October 1987, years after Ervil's death, Jordan was found shot in the head while deer hunting in southern Utah. He had made the fatal error of straying from the protection of his 9 wives and 21 children. Even Ervil's most loyal executioners weren't safe from his paranoia and need for control. How does someone convince ordinary people to become killers? How did Ervil LeBaron turn mothers, children, and community members into a network of assassins willing to murder on command? The answer lies in a sophisticated system of psychological control that combined religious indoctrination, fear, isolation, and the promise of eternal salvation. From the moment people joined Ervil's Church of the Lamb of God, they entered a world where reality was defined entirely by one man's interpretation of God's will. Ervil didn't just claim to be a prophet. He convinced his followers that he was the direct conduit between them and their eternal salvation. He made us believe that if we did not obey, our souls were lost, and we would be cursed forever, one former member recalled. You could not question him, you could only follow. The indoctrination process was methodical and ruthless. New followers were isolated from the outside world and immersed in Ervil's teachings about blood atonement and divine justice. They were told that they were God's chosen people and that everyone outside the sect was either an enemy or a potential convert who needed to be saved or eliminated. Ervil carefully selected individuals for his inner circle of killers. He looked for people who were highly loyal, deeply impressionable, or desperate for acceptance and love. Many of his assassins were family members, wives and children who had been raised to believe that obedience to Ervil was the highest virtue. Rena Chenoweth, who would later murder rival polygamist leader Rulon Allred, described the mindset. God commanded it, and we had no choice. Ervil spoke with authority, and we obeyed. It was the only way to be faithful. The process of turning someone into a killer involved several steps. First came the theological preparation, hours of studying Ervil's writings about blood atonement and the divine necessity of eliminating God's enemies. Then came the personal bonding. Ervil would spend time with potential assassins, making them feel special and chosen for a sacred mission. Finally came the specific mission briefing. Assassins were given detailed instructions about methods, timing, and concealment. They were sworn to absolute secrecy and reminded that betrayal would result in their own death. Everything was framed as a holy mission rather than a criminal act. Some of his youngest followers were particularly vulnerable to this manipulation. His son Ervil LeBaron was just 13 when Ervil died, but he had already been conditioned to see violence as a religious duty. Ervil would later lead a group called the Lambs of God, carrying out murders from his father's hit list well into the 1990s. A prosecutor who worked on cases involving Ervil's children called them the Lord of the Flies generation, children and teenagers who had grown up in a world where violence and absolute obedience were framed as the path to salvation. May 10, 1977. Dr. Rulon Allred, a respected physician and leader of the largest polygamous sect in Utah, was working in his medical office in Murray when 2 women walked in. They weren't there for medical care. They were there to commit murder. Rena Chenoweth and Ramona Marston, both wives of Ervil LeBaron, calmly approached Dr. Allred and shot him multiple times at close range. As he lay dying, they walked out of the office and disappeared into the afternoon crowd. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was a carefully planned assassination ordered by Ervil LeBaron. Dr. Allred's crime? He was Ervil's principal rival for the title of the One Mighty and Strong, the prophesied leader who would unite all fundamentalist Mormon groups under one banner. In Ervil's theology, there could be only one true prophet, and Allred's very existence was an affront to God's plan. What makes this murder even more chilling is what happened next. Ervil, demonstrating his complete lack of fear or remorse, actually sent a hit team to Allred's funeral. They were planning to kill other rival leaders who would be attending the service. Fortunately, heavy police security forced them to withdraw, but the audacity of the plan shows just how confident Ervil had become. Rena Chenoweth would later write in her tell-all memoir, The Blood Covenant, that she felt completely justified in the killing at the time. She had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that she genuinely believed she was doing God's work. It wasn't until years later that she realized she had been manipulated into committing murder. But Allred's assassination was just one name on a much longer list. Ervil had been systematically eliminating anyone he saw as a threat to his authority or a challenge to his claims of divine leadership. In January 1975, Naomi Zarate, the wife of one of Ervil's followers, was declared disobedient by the prophet. She simply disappeared and was never seen again. Her crime? Questioning some of Ervil's more extreme demands. In April 1975, Robert Simons of Grantsville, Utah, made the fatal mistake of disputing Ervil's claim to prophetic authority and declaring himself the One Mighty and Strong. Simons vanished shortly afterward and is presumed to have been executed. In June 1975, Dean Vest, one of Ervil's own military commanders, became sickened by the constant executions and murders. He prepared to defect from the group, but Ervil discovered his plans. Vest was murdered in his sleep before he could escape or go to authorities. What's particularly disturbing about these murders is how they were carried out by people who genuinely believed they were performing religious duties. These weren't hardened criminals or professional killers. They were mothers, children, and community members who had been convinced that murder was a form of worship. You might think that Ervil LeBaron's reign of terror would have ended when he was finally captured and imprisoned. You'd be wrong. In many ways, his most dangerous work was just beginning. Ervil was arrested by Mexican police in May 1979 and extradited to Utah, where he was tried and convicted for the murder of Rulon Allred. He was sentenced to life in prison, but even behind bars, his influence over his followers remained absolute. From his cell in Utah State Prison, Ervil continued to write prolifically. He produced what he called the Book of New Covenants, a document that contained detailed instructions for his followers and, most chillingly, extensive lists of people marked for death. These weren't just the angry rantings of an imprisoned cult leader. They were carefully organized hit lists, complete with names, addresses, and specific instructions for how each murder should be carried out. Ervil had turned his prison cell into a command center for an ongoing campaign of terror. His followers on the outside treated these writings as sacred scripture. They distributed them secretly, studied them obsessively, and most importantly, acted on them. Even after Ervil's death from a heart attack on August 15, 1981, at the age of 56, the murders continued. This is where the story becomes even more disturbing, if that's possible. Ervil's children and most devoted followers continued to carry out killings based on his written instructions. They called these the 4 o'clock murders, because many were carried out in the early morning hours. His son, Ervil LeBaron, emerged as a leader of a group called the Lambs of God, dedicated to completing his father's work. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, people connected to Ervil's original hit lists continued to die under mysterious circumstances. In May 1987, Leo Peter Avoniuk, a religious leader from California, vanished while making a business call near Watsonville. His body was never found, but investigators believe he was murdered by Ervil's followers. In August 1981, just days before Ervil's death, his brother Ervil LeBaron was killed in what was officially ruled a car crash in Mexico. Many investigators believe this was actually another assassination carried out by Ervil's network. The violence even extended to cases that weren't directly connected to Ervil, but were inspired by his teachings. In July 1984, Brenda Lafferty and her baby daughter Erica were found dead in their home in American Fork, Utah. Their throats had been slashed so deeply that their heads were nearly severed. The killers were fundamentalist Mormon brothers who claimed they had received a divine revelation similar to Ervil's teachings about blood atonement. As we reach the end of this dark journey through the life and crimes of Ervil LeBaron, we're left with haunting questions about faith, family, and the capacity for evil that exists within seemingly ordinary communities. Law enforcement officials estimate that Ervil LeBaron was directly or indirectly responsible for the deaths of at least 25 people, though some investigators believe the true number may be much higher. Dozens of others disappeared under suspicious circumstances, their fates unknown to this day. What makes this story particularly tragic is how many of the victims were family members, brothers, daughters, grandchildren, and in-laws, who died simply because they stood in the way of one man's megalomaniacal ambitions. Ervil didn't just destroy his enemies, he systematically dismantled his own family tree. The psychological damage extends far beyond the death toll. Surviving family members and former followers have spent decades trying to understand how they became part of such a destructive movement. Many struggle with guilt, wondering how they could have been convinced that murder was a religious duty. Raina Chenoweth, the wife who carried out the murder of Rulon Allred, eventually wrote her memoir partly as a form of therapy and partly as a warning to others. When The Blood Covenant was published in 1990, Allred survivors filed a civil action against her and won a $52 million wrongful death judgment. Today, Ervil LeBaron is often compared to Charles Manson because of his ability to convince followers to commit murder in his name. But in some ways, Ervil was even more dangerous than Manson because he used religious belief as his primary tool of control. While Manson's influence died with him, Ervil's teachings continued to inspire violence for decades after his death. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this story is what happened to the children raised in Ervil's world. Many grew up believing that violence was not only acceptable, but sacred. They were taught that loyalty to their father was more important than their own lives or the lives of others. Breaking free from that level of indoctrination has proven nearly impossible for some. Mental health professionals who have worked with survivors describe the lasting trauma of growing up in Ervil's community. Children learn to live in constant fear, never knowing when they might be declared disobedient and marked for death. They witnessed murders, participated in cover-ups, and were taught that questioning authority was the worst possible sin. As we close this chapter on Ervil LeBaron, it's clear his story isn't just a relic of the past. It's a warning that still echoes today. His ability to twist faith into fear shows how dangerous unchecked authority can become when wrapped in divine language. Isolated communities, absolute obedience, and slow psychological conditioning turned ordinary people into instruments of violence. What makes this case truly unsettling isn't just the crimes, but how easily belief became a weapon. And the most disturbing question remains: could something like this happen again, under a different name, a different leader, a different faith? The shadow of the so-called killer prophet still lingers, reminding us that evil often disguises itself as righteousness. If you want to go deeper into the unseen details, survivor accounts, and the chilling aftermath of this cult, download the Skoob app now to unlock the full story. Some truths are too disturbing to fade into silence.